Hello everyone! Welcome to another Music Talk Tuesday, and today I thought it would be interesting to briefly address some of my personal favorite musical instruments, and I'm largely basing this list off of basically how they sound more so than, as far as the ability to play the instruments or anything, because I am not a person that has really focused in onto playing a particular instrument, only because I just don't have the time or the energy to really put my time and investment into it. So unfortunately that part of what I enjoy is sort of fallen by the wayside, but hopefully when there is more uh, time and money that could be put forward to something like that, I would love to do it. But unfortunately, sometimes, you can't really enjoy your hobbies unless you have some time and have some things saved on the side that allows you to do those things. But without further ado, let me start off the list by addressing the electric guitar. And in particular, rock is my favorite genre, at least one of my favorite genres. And this particular instrument has had a huge influence on that genre. But it's also crossed over into other genres as well, from country to jazz. It just has played such a fundamental role as far as shaping really the modern day musical accompaniment. I think, although again some people might assume that the electric guitar's influence is maybe not as prominent, at least nowadays when it comes to music, compared to what it was within the 20th century. But I think regardless, there is still something I think that's very fascinating and interesting about the way in which the electric guitar sounds. Uh, and I think that has largely to do with the fact that there's a lot that you can play with as far as when it comes to really executing a particular song through the electric guitar. And it really allows you to play with style and really allows you to blend various sounds together in order to sort of create something that is, I think, unique and interesting. And I think it's only safe to say how versatile this instrument is because, again, like I said before, it has played such a huge role in various genres. So its prominence, I think, is definitely there, although it is not considered to be one of the more traditional musical instruments. Its level of influence, I think, is definitely worth the merit, and I think definitely worth the time and investment if you're interested in that kind of music that it ultimately produces. And again, like I said before, I think the fact that it is not particularly strained to one specific genre is really what allows it to shine and give it this ability for people to really play with it and really kind of figure out where they sort of fit in as far as the instrument is concerned, because again, it just has such a it just has a variety of different personalities to it, and I think that's why it's just one of my favorites, because it just brings out so much more than what you would expect, especially when comparing it to a lot of other traditional musical instruments. The second instrument that I want to briefly mention is the piano, which is sort of the opposite of the electric guitar in the sense that it's largely influenced by the traditional classical genre, classical music genre. Although, again, it has been used in the modern day, obviously, especially when vocals are used. Oftentimes piano is really the instrument that really allows for people to ultimately really practice on their vocals. And so I think it only makes sense the piano has played that sort of influence, but primarily from an instrumental perspective, it's largely through classical music that really the piano does shine. I mean, when you hear Beethoven and you hear Mozart on the piano, it just gives off this very interesting and elaborate uh, sound. And what I think is also really enjoyable about the piano is the fact that it has this real in-depth sense of various emotions. Things can be very happy and go-lucky, or they can be kind of dark and depressing. They can maybe even be angry sounding at points, where there's like a huge sense of intensity. There is just a lot of you can play with as far as when you're creating the music on the piano. And although it has, again, not as influenced as many genres as the electric guitar, it still brings out a lot of interesting things that I think a lot of people can um, gather from their own existence. And I think that's largely due to the fact that the piano, when you hear the way which it sounds, it just brings out all of these different kinds of feelings that people have. And I think that really translates well when an instrument can do that. And the piano, I think, is really one of those instruments that allows a lot of detail and a lot of intricacies within it that really bring out the uh, full expression of what you would expect out of art, which really art is supposed to be about emotion and um, about unleashing something that is very powerful to the sort of human element. So I think that's really important to understand, and I think this is why, in particular, piano, I think, has influenced the whole entirety of music within itself. And I think also why it plays too a heavy role with vocals, because a lot of the times when you're expressing vocals, you're using a certain amount of emotion to ultimately express the things that the song is ultimately trying to say. And the piano gives you a way of really channeling that, I think, really well, unlike a lot of other instruments that are not really capable of doing that. Third instrument that I wanted to mention is the violin. The violin is somewhat similar and different to the piano. There is a lot of grace and a lot of beauty that comes through the violin. And although it is, I think, a fairly challenging instrument, at least from my experience in trying to play the violin, every time I tried, it was I just could not get it right. But despite my lack of talent as far as this instrument is concerned, I just think that it adds so much, especially from an instrumental perspective, as far as really bringing out various, again, emotions that oftentimes can be associated, again, to other classical instruments, in particular the violin. But I think what stands out, at least from uh, at least as far as my perspective of the violin is that unlike the piano that just has the keys, the violin is almost it almost kind of integrates the sounds. I think in a lot more I think almost more complex manner than the piano does. And in doing so, it creates its own kind of, unique sound almost, and you can't really, you know, and this is why I think it remains sort of more distinct. And again, the violin and that kind of area of music is why it's so prevalently used, at least within a lot of instrumental work. So again, I think its influence is wide, and it's used a lot of the times for accompaniment, even even today's music, sometimes you'll see people ultimately use the violin. But it's very powerful, I think, overall in conveying um, certain emotions, and in doing so, creating kind of an interesting picture and also a very uh, dynamic and interesting sound. And in doing so, it makes it, I think, one of the most prominent instruments, I think, that's out there. So I think it only makes sense that it would be on my favorites. Now, the last two that I'm going to mention are actually ones that are not as common, or as, I guess you could say, maybe wildly recognized. Um, Fourth one being the harp. This instrument just has such a soothing uh, sound. It just has this ability to kind of just um, lull you to sleep almost, but in a good way, at least in my opinion. I think the harp is also rather interesting because it almost combines that kind of grace and intricacy of the violin, but at the same time having this very kind of uh, interesting and uh, unique way of playing the instrument that could oftentimes be associated with the piano, which you know, when you're playing the harp, you're kind of playing it like you sort of do a piano almost. Um, but again, you're pulling on strings, and strings are oftentimes associated with the violin. So again, it's I think an interesting way of looking at it, because um, in doing so, it provides a unique sound. The previous particular instruments that I mentioned, that I think do have a really core, uh, passionate sound that can be derived from them, like the piano and even the electric guitar, as well as the violin. But the harp, it's just, you know, it's just very light. There's not a huge amount of energy to it. But when you hear the light, soothing sounds that come from it, it it creates a very interesting feeling, I think, that can be derived from it. It's I think largely primarily due to the fact that it's graceful and peaceful, and it's not really designed to be all too intense. It's just, you know, just playing around uh, with the strings, and in doing so, just kind of um, being that relaxing sound that you would come to expect from an instrument like it. Um, and I think oftentimes it makes sense that the harp would sometimes be even associated with sort of heaven, because, you know, heaven's supposed to be very, again, peaceful, soothing, calm, beautiful. You know, it's supposed to be uh, it's supposed to have this kind of angelicness to it, and at the same time, maybe even a certain amount of innocence as well. So I think that makes sense that oftentimes when you think of the harp, sometimes you think of an angel playing it. But that's ultimately all I think I can say about that instrument. And lastly, the other instrument that I wanted to briefly mention, that is one of my favorites, and actually I think is a rather unique instrument, is the saxophone. Um, what I like in particular about this instrument is, on the one hand, it can be very relaxing and soothing, and um, be romantic almost in that sense. It can also be very upbeat and um, very kind of lively as well. So it has that kind of interesting combination to it. And unlike the electric guitar or the piano or the violin, that that are either more classical oriented instruments or more modern day instruments. This particular instrument, the saxophone, has largely influenced jazz and is part of the whole trumpet section, so to speak, of instruments, at least from what I can tell. And it just has this emphasis, though, to it, and in doing so, the way in which it's presented, I think just comes off, at least for me personally, a little bit more effectively than a lot of the other similar instruments. And I think that's why oftentimes it's more associated with a specific genre, in particular jazz. And I really do appreciate its ability to kind of relax you, but at the same time, it can also get you up on your feet. So it's a very interesting instrument in that sense, and also a very interesting looking instrument, to say the least, and one that oftentimes I find myself enjoying at least the quality that is sort of presented with it, because you just feel the energy, and I think it comes off fairly effectively, and works to at least the genre of jazz fairly effectively, because again, jazz offers a variety of moods, in particular the more upbeat mood as well as the more relaxed and soothing mood. But I think, though, that's really ultimately all I can say about all of these instruments. I'd be more than happy to hear what personal favorites anybody else has. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say for this video. However, if there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.